there are these months, especially in Saskatchewan, not necessarily this year so far, but where we're kind of blocked in by snow and cold temperatures, and there's just the routine of feeding the animals, and oftentimes that can end, in early afternoon. So there is some time available to rest and relax, enjoy um, a little bit of the down season, and then get to the work, which I'm going to talk about tonight, which I think is vital to our success here at the BBRC Ranch. Um, so I'm originally from Montana. I married into the Campbell family. I've been here for 21, two, almost 22 years. And it has been such a learning experience, rich with all kinds of education about the land, the concepts of holistic management. And as I embark on becoming an educator and a consultant and helping people experience success, much like we have here on our ranch, it has truly been a joy and has had some challenges. And I'll talk about some of those tonight. So I'm going to do a little bit of a presentation. I imagine it's going to be about 20 minutes, depending on if there are immediate questions in between, and then we can have some discussion afterwards. But if you've got an important question, by all means, put it in the chat or ask right away. There's no sense in forgetting that information. So I call this seasonal planning, but I don't want that to be misleading at all. Much of what we do on the BBRC Ranch in Northwest Saskatchewan, and I'll talk about the ranch in just a minute, is year-round planning. So while I'm going to be talking about some of the winter months and how we allocate some of that time, I I don't want it to sound like once we're done with the winter planning, we stop planning altogether. So a little bit about our operation. If you're not familiar with our family, we are in Meadow Lake, which is kind of in the northwest part of the territory. Um, my generation, so my husband and I are third generation. So um, Mark, my husband, and his brother Scott, obviously sons to Don, who's on the call tonight. But it was Don's father who originally purchased this ranch along the Beaver River. And our youngest son, Birch, who is now 18, does express some interest in perhaps ranching in the future. Nothing anytime too soon, but he would be then fourth generation. We're cow-calf and long yearling operations, so we do calve out our maternal herd, and if everything aligns, we background those calves or send them to the feedlot, retain ownership, and then bring them back to grass them and sell them as long yearlings. And we run anywhere from 6 to 800. Right now, we're running closer to that 600 mark because we've had a couple of exceptionally challenging years. And happy to say the cattle market is high, so maybe we can stay at those lower numbers. We raise our own bulls here. Nothing too fancy. We're not doing a lot of AIing or, don't have a lot of herds, but we do keep our own bulls and have a pretty uniform herd, and we're pretty proud of our herd. We also raise extra age heifers, which means that we don't breed them in their first year. We wait for them to be 2 before exposing them. And currently, the majority of our ranch is run by myself and my husband, Mark, and my brother-in-law, Scott. So Don and Bev are still live on the ranch and are active in terms of the shareholders of the operation, but the day-to-day operations are run by the 3 of us. And it's inherent in what we do here to share our experiences with others in the community. And that happens multiple ways. We have field days here. We do a lot of education. And I personally hold holistic management courses, speak on occasion at conferences, do quite a bit of one-on-one consulting with other families. And that can look differently depending on what each operation is asking for. And we hold a 9-month internship program, and that focuses on the principles of holistic management. So you can see a common thread. Holistic management kind of runs in and out of our operation in our family. So this planning that I'm talking about, it's no mystery. I mean, you can Google and find out what the benefits of planning are, and you can really try to say that it's a waste of time, but nobody's going to believe you because the research is out there. Planning produces results. So I'm not here to tell you that it's a good idea. We all know that. I'm hoping tonight to show you the methodology that we use, and then also maybe inspire you to pick up the pencil again, or re-engage in your previous planning, or to start a plan of your own. Some of the things that I think planning takes that we may not necessarily recognize, we just know that it takes time, that's for sure, but it does take some intention, setting time aside and realizing the importance. And also, planning often takes self-reflection, which is probably why a lot of people don't do it, is because that can be really hard work, hurt your brain a little bit. It requires, for planning to be extremely effective, I think it requires honesty. And not to say that people are dishonest, but that getting down to the core of why you're doing what you're doing requires some honesty, and that's pretty easy to avoid. So, and then it can require collaboration, especially if you're not in business, or if you're in business with other people. But even if you're not, your vision may require the help of family, friends, neighbors, those kinds of things. So you definitely need people to buy into what you're trying to do. So it requires a lot of commitment of all of those things. And that's not an exhaustive list, but I did want to identify some of the reasons why people balk at planning. And this might be your barrier, any one of these things. So tonight, this is also not an exhaustive list. There are many, many types of planning, and I'm not going to get into all of the types of planning. These are the ones that we focus on our ranch, especially during the winter months. And I'll dive into each of them just a little bit, and happy to answer questions afterwards. So, goal setting. I think it stands to reason that if you're trying to get somewhere, it's probably a good idea to have a plan of where that place is, that destination, at least the direction of where you're going. In holistic management, there's a 3-part goal model that BRC Ranch has been using since I got here in 2002. And even before that, I guess 2000, when we started planning to move here to Meadow Lake. And this goal setting is based on 3 major concepts, or parts of the goal. What are our values? That's what we ask ourselves. And I think this January, February, we're going to be asking these questions again as we revisit our goal as a management team. What are our values, and what does that look like in terms of translating to a quality of life? What is it that we want our lives to look like, and how do we want to feel about that? Secondly, what sort of behaviors or systems do we need to put in place in order to attain the quality of life that we desire? So if we want to live off the land, have quality time with family, produce, high quality food to nourish our bodies, we clearly have to act in a certain way in order to make that happen, which means we need to create, the time, the energy, the resources in order for that to happen. So we would then list what aspects of the quality of life that we desire, and then put a system or a behavior and attach it to each one of those, to make that happen. And so we're going to be kind of polishing this up, hopefully in February. I just talked to the person who we invite to help us through this process, and she's got some dates available. So I'm really hoping that we can nail those down. And then the third part of this 3-part goal setting, or 3-part context, if you will, is what does the future look like if we're able to do that like define our quality of life and attain that. And what does that look like far into the future? So for generations to come, what does our operation look like? What does our family feel like? And what does the community look like around us? So I'm going to show you an example of, this is kind of the older version of our goal that we are going to be modifying here this year or in 2024. The words are not as important. I just wanted to show you, we've laid out quality of life, production, or those behaviors and systems that we want to take into account in order to make that quality of life happen. And then the future landscape description, or that future vision of what we see for our operation and family. So this is just one piece of like a mosaic, which is what this little gray square symbolizes. And I want you to just hold on to those little gray squares. I'm going to be showing you quite a few of them as they pertain to the overall seasonal planning. The second form of planning that we take on, and we're in the process of re-looking at our 3 to 5 year strategic plan, because we've come up against the end of 2023. And I'll show you an example, but our strategic plan focuses on these questions. These 7 questions kind of drive the actions of our organization. So we pick focus areas, and so it could be people, land, and finance, for example. And then we ask in each of these areas, what does an ideal state look like for our operation? So if we can envision 3 to 5 years from now, what the ideal situation would be, let's say for our people, then we would, write some statements that say we're, closer than we ever have been. We have that quality of time, or quality time with the people who we love. And that's something that we can actually describe in words, what that looks like in an ideal state. And then after we've identified that, we would identify what we expect to see if we attain that ideal state. So what are the outcomes that come from having close personal relationships with family members? And then what actions? So you can see it sort of distilling down from, we have this focus area of people, we can describe what an ideal state is, we can determine what the expected outcomes might be if we reach that state. And then we're going to start making a list of action items to take in that particular focus area. Once we've identified the action, which is perhaps, we'll have a monthly family meal. If that's what our ideal state, or the action item that our ideal state requires, we're going to put somebody in charge of that. So who's responsible for ensuring this action gets done? We would assign a champion. So somebody would be responsible. They wouldn't have to necessarily cook the meal, but they just have to make sure that it gets on the to-do list, like who is hosting the monthly meeting, for example. The monthly family dinner. Then we would just set a timeline. So when can we expect? So if it's a monthly dinner, we would just say monthly, as it's never going to fully be done. And then lastly, we would describe what sort of resources this is going to require. Yeah, it might take a little bit of money to host a meal, but significantly, it just takes time and the dedication for people to, to want to come. So marketing that idea a little bit, saying, hey, this is a really good idea that we get together once a month, but also that we allocate the time to do that. So we'd identify time. So I'll show you the example here. So you can see up at the top, one of our focus areas from the strategic planning year, I think it was from 20 to 23, we focused on our corporate share structure. So we were in the middle of transition in 2020 of creating a new share structure. So you can see in an ideal state by 2023, B-Bar Sea Ranch will have done these things. In an ideal state, we would look like that. And we've identified the expected outcomes. We put action items to those dates and who is responsible. And I didn't put the whole thing on, but after that is the resources of time and money required for that. So Again, another piece of the mosaic of planning. The next is the land planning and the grazing or cropping, whichever your operation is into. I'm going to focus on land planning and the grazing planning because we have cattle. Land planning, a lot of people don't really know how to describe that. So in holistic management, one of the ways we describe it is how to manage for the best possible physical infrastructure. So things like watering systems, fence lines, where the tree lines are, and doing so in an economical and a very practical way. So a lot of folks that I work with talk about using permaculture design, depending on the scope and scale of their operation, because this fits in really nicely. It's about working in efficiencies. So we don't do a ton of this because we're an established operation. However, in the past, we have looked at, what do we want to do with our land planning, mainly our grazing, what sort of fencing infrastructure, what water systems, if anything, needs to be put in place, or what water sources are we going to utilize, and think about, do fence lines need to change? One possible example of this year is we've had drier years than normal, and there is potential for us to utilize some land that is normally kind of, has lots of bush, maybe is wetter than we'd like to graze on. But because we've had dry years, we have some grass available. It doesn't have adequate fencing. So we might utilize January, February, March when things are frozen to access that grass and put up some new fencing. So we'll take a look at the land planning, and I'll show you an example or a picture of that. Grazing planning. This is something that we attribute a lot of the success and the fertility of our soil health, and the ability to, at least double, if not triple, the carrying capacity of cattle on this ranch. Grazing planning, simply put, is getting our animals to the right place at the right time for the right reasons. And there's a whole other presentation about why that's a good idea and how to get that done. I will show you an example of what our grazing plan looks like. And at the end of the presentation, I kind of line out when we're doing these things, but the grazing planning obviously needs to happen before grass starts to grow in our operation. So generally that means around March or April, into March, beginning of April is when we'll work on this. Financial planning, quite simply, is how to plan for a profit. We have had a financial plan every single year since I've been on the operation. And we usually start, depends on the year, but we usually start, because our fiscal year is April 1 to March 31st. We want to have a plan in place before that begins. So we might start planning in February and March, and have something solid and ready to start and monitor by April 1. So here's an example of land planning. This is the map that shows all of our fence lines. It is due for an update. I've been saying that probably for about 10 years now, as there are a few different fence lines, and the roads have moved just a little bit, but it is still sufficient in order to get our intern to the right place, especially if they have map skills. So what I'm showing you here is a picture of our ranch. On the far right is a highway. Kind of on the north and the west side are lakes, which is our land boundary, and some muskeg and crown land on the west or left side. We do have one neighbor down in the very southwest corner, and then the Beaver River. The rest of makes up the rest of our boundary. There's about 4,000 acres here, and there are currently about 104 paddocks. That means a lot of fencing. And so that land planning that I was telling you about didn't happen overnight. It's been the evolution of the last basically 35, if not longer, 35 years, but more intensely in the last 20, where you see these irregular kind of seemingly random pastures, but they're actually fairly intentional. Ease of where the fence lines go, and also the size is based on the quality of those paddocks. And these paddocks will hold our herd approximately 1 to 2 days during the growing season. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. But we've got them kind of metered out to carry our herd so that we can move on a daily or every other day basis during the growing season. So the land planning portion is kind of integral in, looking at things. And sometimes fencing in the summer is easier, but sometimes fencing in the winter is easier depending on where things go. If you look at the very top right, where the highway almost kind of meets with the lake in the north and east corner, this is where we might be considering putting in some new fence. There's some of our land up there that might be accessible. And if years continue to be drier, we might want to access more grass. Here's an example of a grazing plan. I don't have a digital one that I can show you, but I do work with folks now, and they can just plug in onto an Excel spreadsheet, a grazing plan. We still use paper. It's tangible, can be picked up and moved around from place to place and adjusted pretty easily. This is an older version, but I just wanted to show you that at the beginning of the year, on the left-hand side are listed all of the paddocks, and then across the top are the dates, the months, April, May, June, July, August, September, October. So those would be sort of our grazing months. And the boxes indicate a herd is moving from paddock to paddock over the number of days, which are those little tiny rectangular slivers. And this planning happens, as I mentioned, sometime around the end of March, beginning of April, before the growing season would happen. And then all the notations on the side are as the season goes on, we keep track of that plan. And then lastly, for this particular slide is the example of, this is a gross profit analysis. So this isn't an entire financial plan. That's a whole nother presentation, but this is an example of a gross profit. So how to plan for a profit is to be able to analyze an enterprise and recognize how many dollars are you making per unit that can contribute to your overhead costs. So for every cow and calf we're running on the BBRC ranch, this one's not current, so don't look at the prices or the weights. If for every cow calf that we're running, if we can generate a gross profit that'll show us X number of dollars are going back to help us run the rest of the ranch, that can be very helpful in planning for profit. Because if that's a negative number, we don't want more cows. If we're losing money with every cow, we shouldn't add any more cows. But if we're making money with every cow, then perhaps we should look at increasing if we're looking to increase our profit. And of course, have the grass to do that. Again, another piece of the mosaic. So all these pieces that we've talked about, the goal setting, having a solid direction of where we want to go, having a strategy, what areas, because there's so many areas that we could focus on, having a strategy of picking maybe 3 or 4 focus areas and putting some action items to those in a strategic plan. And then on the annual basis, looking at, is everything in place where we want it to be? That land planning is, is our grazing plan solid? Are we ready to start moving things around? And then the financial plan, are we planning for a profit in the upcoming fiscal year? Kind of on a larger scale, and this is where we're going to be spending some time this year, I think between January and March, is what does our succession plan look like? So we have successfully transitioned from Don and Bev, so my husband's parents, to operationally to Mark and Scott and myself. And we're tidying up kind of the final stages of how those shares transfers. And as soon as we kind of are finishing up one, it's time to start the next succession plan. Because as I mentioned, my youngest son, who's 18, has some interest. So we're going to be looking at, what does that look like in the next 10 years? How do we, extend the invitation, make it viable for the size of operation to perhaps trickle down back to one ownership, if that's kind of what we decide to do. So the succession planning, and I've just pulled out a couple of things that I think are key as we move into planning. So this is planning that's going to start this year, but is likely going to last over the next 10 years, is to have that 3-part written goal, to have what we want clearly defined. That doesn't mean we have to have all the action items. What we want, that ideal state, we want to have clearly defined. Divisions of responsibility. And I'll show you an example of this, and what contributes to our success here at BBAR-C is having all the things that kind of make our operation tick, and who is ultimately responsible or overseeing that those things get done. Having that strategy, so that long-term vision that I talked about, and then consultation. This is probably those bits of wisdom that we're so grateful for. Dawn, you're here, for somebody to say, so this is what we want. At some point in time, after we've identified what it is that we want, let's bring in the professionals that can help us get there, as opposed to saying, okay, we need to transfer this land. Let's go hire a tax or an accountant and an attorney and see what they tell us we can do. I think there's a really important timing aspect of being able to identify what it is that we want here on the BBAR-C Ranch, and then bringing in the professionals when appropriate to get those things done and let them figure out how to do that. So this is another aspect of planning that we're going to be getting into this year, starting in this year. The divisions of responsibility that I talked about, which has been partially contributed to our success here, almost 4 years ago, when we started to get together to make the BBAR-C pick, is to lay out these divisions. And it doesn't get down into the weeds, but it does give us a framework to say, if these 4 divisions or areas of responsibility are important, what are those things under that division, and then who is ultimately responsible. And this has been really helpful in running an operation where there are many players on the field. And so I highly encourage people, when they're doing planning, to think about we're not just going to talk about the fence getting done. We're going to talk about, okay, who's ultimately responsible. Now, they could delegate that to somebody else, but the buck does stop with that particular champion or manager. So another piece of the mosaic. Here's a picture of the annual timeline that we've kind of followed over this past several years. January this year is going to cover succession planning, so that isn't something that we focus on every single year, but 2024 is definitely going to have that component. February, we do team building. Sometimes that is January, February, but we'll often hire in a facilitator. So we've been known to bring in our family friend, but also colleague, coworker, holistic management educator, Kelly. She's been with us since the very beginning in 2000 when we started this venture. So she's part of our regular planning diet. In March, we'll do that financial plan. So end of February, beginning of March, and making sure we have a solid financial plan starting April 1. And then in April, or end of March, beginning of April, we'll do the grazing plan, which could also be kind of the cropping plan if you have crops, and then the rest of the year. Now, the rest of the year is about putting all these plans into place, but we are consistently monitoring. So we're putting those plans or implementing those plans, putting them into place, but then we've got to loop back and say, okay, are we on track for, is our team strong? Is our financial plan on track? How does the grazing plan look? And I would often say that the grazing plan is one that we'll revisit, because the factors, the variables of weather and all those things come into play. So that's probably one that we monitor the most. But the rest of the year still is about planning. We're just following what we've laid out in beginning of the year. it's a really great quote. Business opportunities are a lot like buses. There's always another one coming. And what I think about planning is that it allows us to determine which bus to get on, which one is headed in the right direction for us. Um, I hesitate using the word right because it really depends on your context. There is no right and wrong, but there is a more appropriate bus that is headed in the direction that you want to go. And I think without the planning, we're likely to get on a bus that might take us in the opposite direction that we want to go. And so it'll take us time to kind of get back on track again. So doing that planning will help prevent us from getting sidetracked. So lastly, all these pieces of the mosaic, you know, seeing the forest for the trees is sometimes really difficult. That in our year, when we focus on planning at the beginning of the year, when things aren't as crazy or busy with calving and branding and moving the cattle every single day, it takes a little bit of perspective to see how all of those pieces fall together to make our year successful. So if we take a bunch of these plans and look at them in isolation, you're going to see, basically a gray square. Goal setting will tell you one aspect of our operation or family. Financial planning will tell you an entirely different aspect of our operation. And they do all fit together, but they don't necessarily, or it's not as easy to see what they all mean until you step back a little bit. And I don't know if you can see, you might have to blur your eyes a little bit or look off and use your peripheral vision. But all those little planning pieces can actually become a masterpiece or, really start to show you the picture of what your operation looks like when they're all brought together throughout the year. So if you haven't seen it yet, that's a mosaic image of Abraham Lincoln. So hopefully by me describing, you can kind of see his dark hair and his beard. And so all those little planning pieces come together to make a picture. And with that, I will open it up. This is my contact information, our QR code for the BBRC Ranch on Facebook if you're interested. And always happy to continue the conversation. I do happen to help people with planning as part of the consulting for our ranch to share our success with other individuals. So if you have any interest, feel free to contact me.